Dawn brought a thick mist, covering the property line like a silent, dark veil. The trail of trampled grass led up to the body, a lone figure lying between the Vasquez and Montgomery lands, two families whose fierce rivalry spanned generations. Detective David North stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his coat as he crossed the field. He'd seen plenty of awful things in his career, but something about this case stirred a sour feeling in his gut, a sense he couldn't shake off. The body was of a young man, pale skin and eyes staring blankly into the void. What really caught David's attention, though, was the fist tightly clenched around something as if it were important. David knelt down, prying the cold fingers open to reveal a crumpled piece of paper with a handwritten note. Not all blood washes away the stains of the past. A shiver ran down David's spine. This note felt like it was meant for him, like someone was trying to remind him of something he'd tried to forget. It had been 5 years since his wife Laura died in a car accident that, deep down, he'd always known wasn't an accident. The pain and doubt had consumed him since then, and he'd thrown himself into his work, solving every kind of crime, perhaps hoping he'd find some clue that would lead him to the truth about Laura. But all he had were questions and no answers. As he walked around the body, he noticed tracks leading towards the woods. It looked like someone had been watching, maybe waiting to make sure the job was done. He knew that among the two families, many would have reasons to want this young man dead, especially if he was considered a threat to the shaky truce between the Vasquez and the Montgomery families. The air felt heavy with a sense of darkness surrounding him, as if the trees were whispering secrets he wasn't ready to hear. Just then, David took a quick look around and found a trail of blood leading to the fence that divided the properties. He glanced at the trees surrounding the field and saw a lone crow perched on a branch, watching him with a steady, calculating gaze. The bird's presence felt like a bad omen, a reminder that nothing good could come from this morning. Curious, he moved cautiously, scanning his surroundings. Suddenly, he felt someone's presence. Carolina Vasquez, the headstrong lawyer, was there, her expression grave as she looked at the body. She seemed to be fighting back a wave of emotions, and despite her tough exterior, her eyes betrayed a hint of despair. David knew her well. Despite her youth, Carolina was a force to be reckoned with a bravery that sometimes bordered on recklessness. She muttered something about the endless hatred between the families, as if there was a curse that refused to be broken. But before David could respond, Tom Montgomery approached, a burly young man with a defensive, defiant stance. Tom's eyes shifted between David and Carolina, resentment etched on his face. It seemed like he and Carolina had met there for a specific purpose, a secret goal that didn't include the detective. David was aware that the two had been seen together, like a mismatched Romeo and Juliet trying to break a tradition of hatred. Carolina and Tom exchanged glances for a moment, a silent exchange that said more than any words could. David noticed it, and for the first time, he sensed there was more to their relationship than just rivalry. David approached the body again, this time examining the fatal wound that had left the young man sprawled on the grass. The precision of the stab suggested whoever the killer was, they knew exactly where to strike. He stood up slowly, the note still clutched in his fingers, as if the answer to everything was right there, under his nose. But he knew that scrap of paper was just the beginning. There was something darker unraveling, something that both families were determined to keep hidden at all costs. The detective then stepped away, giving one last look at Carolina and Tom, now engaged in a heated argument. They were so absorbed they hardly noticed when he got back into his car. David knew he had to talk to old John Vasquez, the family patriarch, but he hesitated to cross that territory. The Vasquez and the Montgomery families had always lived under mutual suspicion, and he didn't know how willing John would be to cooperate. Still, he knew he had no choice. He had to go all the way, even if it meant reopening wounds that had never healed. Determined, he started the engine and headed out, fully aware that the road ahead would be full of dangers and revelations he might wish he'd never known. David recalled a dark night years ago when he and Laura had walked together, their laughter echoing in the shadows. She had held onto his arm, her eyes shining under the city lights. "You'll always have a choice," she'd said, and he never quite understood what she meant by those words. But now, facing the possibility of solving this mystery, he felt a wave of determination rise within him. This case seemed to be pulling him into something bigger, like a tide that would force him to confront his own ghosts. In the rearview mirror, the young man's body faded into the mist as David drove towards the Vasquez estate. In his mind, the cryptic note still pulsed, like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. He was bracing himself to step into a storm of revelations, where every answer would raise a new question, and where each step would bring him closer to the unknown. The silence was piercing, but he knew the peace of that morning wouldn't last. This was just the beginning. The winding road leading to the Vasquez estate cut through the fields like a scar, lined with trees that seemed to watch David's every move. As he drove, memories of his last visit to these lands flooded his mind. Back then, Laura was still alive, and they'd come to investigate a land dispute involving the Vasquez family. Ever since, David had avoided this part of town, but now it was inevitable. When he arrived at the mansion, he was met with an oppressive silence, as if the house itself was waiting to reveal its secrets. John Vasquez, the family patriarch, was seated in a leather chair in the living room, his eyes fixed on David with an intensity that made him hesitate. John was an old man, but his gaze remained as sharp as ever. It seemed he knew what this visit was about because his first comment was direct. "I warned you that nothing good would come from this place," he said, his voice firm, as though repeating an old proverb. "My family and the Montgomerys have been cursed from the start. That boy's death won't be the first victim, and it won't be the last." David sat across from John, trying to read the man behind the harsh words. There was something strange in the way he spoke, a sort of resignation, as if he was tired of fighting an invisible enemy. David mentioned the note he found on the body, hoping John could shed some light on it, but the old man just shook his head, evasive, as if the note was just another piece of a long history of hatred and betrayal. "The Montgomerys," John continued, "have always been enemies. Since my father took this land, they've hated us. And I did my part to keep that distance. There are things that no note can explain, detective. Things that were buried with time. You're dealing with something bigger than you can imagine." David tried to press him for more, but he knew he wouldn't get anything else out of John that day. He said his goodbyes and left the house, feeling like every step he took was being watched. As he opened the front door, he found Carolina waiting outside, her expression serious. She held an envelope in her hands and, without a word, handed it to David. He opened it and saw an old, faded photo of two children playing by a fence. Behind them, in the shadows, stood the silhouette of a man he instantly recognized. It was John, but beside him was an unknown man, who he guessed was a Montgomery. Carolina invited him to walk, and as they made their way down a stone path, she started talking about the past. She explained how she'd recently discovered that her mother had been secretly involved with a Montgomery before marrying John. Upon learning the truth, Carolina realized the hatred between the families ran deeper than any land dispute. She also revealed that Tom was her half-brother, the result of that forbidden romance between their parents. The revelation shocked David, but he stayed calm, absorbing each word like pieces of a dark puzzle. "I had to tell you," she said, looking at him with desperate eyes. "Because ever since I found out, I've been getting threats. That note isn't the first. It's like someone wants to keep it all hidden, and I don't know who to trust anymore." David listened in silence. Her words echoed in his mind, but there was something in her tone that made him uneasy. He sensed that Carolina was holding something back. There was a reluctance in her words, as if the secret was even bigger than she could understand. As they reached the end of the path, Tom approached, looking irritated and visibly tense. He glanced at David and Carolina, sensing they were sharing an important conversation, then turned to the detective. "If you're sharing secrets, I think it's only fair you know," he said, his voice tight. "There's a document. Something my grandfather kept hidden for years, an agreement he said would end everything. Carolina and I believe it's still hidden somewhere between the properties. And we won't stop until we find it." David realized he was now caught up in a dangerous game where each piece of information pushed him closer to a truth that seemed to slip through his fingers. Tom explained that the document was a kind of contract signed by the family's founders, something they believed could either bring peace or forever seal everyone's fate. David questioned whether this document really existed or if it was just a legend created to keep the families in check. But Tom seemed certain of its existence, and Carolina confirmed she'd seen clues pointing to the document's reality. Yet the mystery was deepening. David knew that to find the truth, he'd have to follow every clue, and for now, Carolina and Tom seemed to be his only allies. They decided to explore the old barn at the property's edge, where they believed the document might be hidden. The place was known to hold the family's old belongings, and the thought that something buried there for years was intriguing. Just as they were about to leave, David received a text message on his phone. It was a photo showing the barn entrance, with a single crow perched on the door, a symbol that seemed to follow him with every step. They headed to the barn under a gray sky, with heavy clouds hanging above. When they arrived, they noticed the door was slightly ajar, and as they entered, they were greeted by a cold, heavy air. The place was covered in dust and cobwebs, but Carolina seemed determined, guiding them to the back, where she believed the document was hidden. David scanned the area, alert to any sign of danger. He knew they were taking a risk, but he also felt they were close to something important. After a few minutes of searching, they found a hidden compartment under the wooden floor. Carolina pried up a board, revealing a small, rusty metal box. They opened it, but instead of the document, they found a single piece of paper with an ominous message: "The truth lies in the blood." David felt a surge of frustration but also an increasing unease. That message, like all the others, seemed to point to something deeper, something he still couldn't fully grasp. As they left the barn, a shadow moved at the entrance. David pulled Carolina and Tom behind a stack of hay, watching as a masked figure slipped by, as if stalking them. They held their breath, but the figure seemed unaware of their presence and, within seconds, disappeared into the darkness. David knew that if he wanted to uncover the truth, he'd have to confront this new enemy. The tension in the air was palpable, and he felt that the hunt had only just begun. Leaving the barn, they decided that, to stay safe, they'd have to be discreet. Tom suggested they meet again, but in secret, to avoid suspicion. David agreed, knowing that from this moment on, they were all marked. The search for the document would continue, but now he knew danger was close by, and one wrong step could cost them their lives. With the mist rising around them, David looked at Carolina and Tom, realizing that this temporary pact might be their only chance to get to the bottom of the mystery. The night's chill seemed to seep into David's bones as he parked his car in the garage. Stepping into his house, he was met with an unusual silence. Laura always said houses had their own breath, and he never quite understood what she meant until that night when he felt something was off. There was an unsettling emptiness, as if the darkness hid something beyond the ordinary. He checked his watch, realizing it was later than he thought. He took off his coat and headed into the living room, but when he turned on the light, his gaze fell on the table. There, on the polished wood, was a photograph of his wife, the same one he kept locked away in an album in the closet. How did it get there? Beside the photo, there was a note. He approached, heart racing, and picked up the piece of paper. She was never an accident. His hands started to shake. David had always had his suspicions about Laura's death, but seeing this written out in front of him brought his fears to life. He tried to steady his breathing, reaching for his phone to call the police, but before he could grab it, he heard a noise behind him. He turned, but no one was there. He followed the sound to the bedroom, where he found the closet rummaged through, with something missing. One drawer had been opened, and documents were scattered across the floor. David knelt down to look through the papers, and that's when he saw it. A photo of his wife with the Vasquez family, taken years before he'd even met her. How had he never known? His mind raced with questions, but he knew he had to stay calm. He took a deep breath and began gathering the papers, trying to make sense of what it all meant. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was an anonymous message with just a location, the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. "If you want answers, come alone," the text read. David glanced around, trying to process what he just read. He knew it was a trap, but he had no other choice. He pocketed his phone, grabbed his coat, and headed back to his car. On the drive over, he tried to piece together the puzzle. His mind was flooded with images of Laura, the Vasquez family, and the body in the field. Was it all connected? When he arrived at the cemetery, the moon was shrouded by heavy clouds, and the silence was oppressive. David walked between the old headstones, feeling the weight of history around him. As he approached the location from the message, he saw a figure standing with its back to him, hooded, waiting. He crept closer, ready to draw his gun if necessary. The figure turned slowly, revealing a masked face with an impassive expression. The stranger raised a hand and tossed something at David's feet. It was a small, rusted metal box with a crow emblem on the lid. David bent down and opened the box. Inside, there was a key and a piece of faded fabric with Laura's name stitched into it. Anger boiled up inside him, but he tried to stay composed. Before he could say anything, the masked figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving David alone with the box and more questions than answers. He headed back to his car, clutching the box like it was his last connection to Laura. He needed to understand what it all meant, and he knew he was closer than ever. Back home, David spent the night wide awake. He tried to figure out the meaning of the key, but nothing seemed to indicate where it belonged. He decided to visit John Vasquez the next day and confront him, but when he arrived, he was greeted by a tense and visibly shaken Carolina. She explained that someone had broken into the property during the night and stolen old documents that had been stored in the basement. Hearing this, David felt a chill run down his spine. The break-ins at his house and the Vasquez estate couldn't be a coincidence. He knew someone was trying to stop them from discovering the truth. "Find anything?" Carolina asked, her voice low, as if she feared someone might overhear. David hesitated before showing her the box he'd found at the cemetery. Carolina examined it closely, especially the crow emblem. She explained that, according to an old legend, the crow was the guardian of the family's secrets, a symbol of death and betrayal. Hearing this, David realized he was becoming tangled in a web of intrigue far beyond what he could have imagined. They decided to meet with Tom, who agreed to help them track down the missing document. The trio headed to an abandoned warehouse where Tom believed his grandfather had hidden some important papers before he died. When they arrived, the place was deserted, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. David knelt to examine an old wooden box, but before he could open it, a gunshot echoed through the building. Carolina and Tom dropped to the ground as David tried to locate the source of the shot. The silence that followed was eerie. They waited a few minutes, but heard nothing else. They decided it was better to leave and plan their next move with more caution. Before leaving, David noticed a strange mark on the wall, a symbol resembling the crow on the box. He snapped a photo and left, promising himself he'd find the person behind all these threats. Back in the car, he felt like prey being hunted, but his desire to uncover the truth about Laura was stronger than his fear. After parting ways, David and Carolina agreed to meet again the next day to share what they'd found. When he returned home, he found another anonymous message on his phone: "Stop chasing the impossible, or you'll lose more than you've already lost." He felt the anger rise, but at the same time, he knew he was getting closer. He could feel the walls closing in, but he wouldn't back down. The memory of Laura, the image of her face, drove him to keep going. David knew Carolina and Tom were in this as deep as he was, but he needed to act alone to keep them safe. He spent the night going over every detail, every clue, trying to piece the puzzle together. The truth was there, so close, yet it seemed to slip through his fingers. He knew the next step would be critical, that every move could be his last, but he didn't care. All he wanted was justice for Laura, and nothing, not even the threat of death, would make him stop. When the sun rose, he was already decided on what he needed to do. The truth was there, so close, yet it seemed to slip through his fingers. He knew the next step would be critical, that every move could be his last, but he didn't care. All he wanted was justice for Laura, and nothing, not even the threat of death, would make him stop. When the sun rose, he was already decided on what he needed to do. The sun hadn't fully risen when David met up with Carolina and Tom at the outskirts of town, where an old, dilapidated barn stood on the horizon. The weathered structure, covered in ivy and faded to a dull red, felt like a monument to the past conflicts of their two families. The place gave off an air of abandonment, but something about it seemed imposing, as if it was guarding a secret that refused to be revealed. David looked at the two of them, seeing that, despite everything, they were just as determined as he was to press on. They pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, feeling the wooden floor creak beneath their feet. David switched on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the dusty space, revealing cobwebs and old furniture covered in sheets, like ghosts from a forgotten time. They moved towards the center of the barn, where Tom pointed to the ground. Under a dusty rug lay a metal hatch, partially hidden by bales of hay. David and Tom moved the hay aside while Carolina pulled the rug back, exposing the hatch. This, they believed, was where the document was hidden. David opened the hatch and climbed down the narrow ladder, with Carolina and Tom following close behind. The air below was musty and thick, but there was a sense that they were getting close to something significant. At the bottom, they found a small room, illuminated only by the beam of David's flashlight. On the walls hung old photographs showing members of both families during peaceful times. It was strange to see those faces smiling, as if nothing could break the harmony between them. Tom pointed to a shelf in the corner, filled with folders and faded papers. They started to sift through them but found only old land purchase documents. Nothing indicating the existence of an agreement between the families. Carolina sighed in frustration, but David calmed her, nodding towards a wooden cabinet at the back of the room. They walked over and opened it, revealing a locked drawer. David took out the key he'd found in the cemetery box, and with a soft click, the drawer opened. Inside was a folder marked with the crow symbol. He pulled out the folder and opened it. Inside was a single, yellowed document written in elegant script. As he read, David realized they had indeed found the agreement they were searching for. The text revealed that, years ago, the families had struck a pact to split the wealth from a gold mine discovered on their lands, a secret they had guarded with their lives. However, the agreement included a sinister clause: any breach of the pact would curse the future generations. David understood that the hatred between the families had been orchestrated to protect this secret. Carolina took the document and read it carefully, her eyes widening with disbelief. She looked at Tom, searching for an explanation, but he appeared just as shocked as she was. As they prepared to leave, they heard a noise from the floor above. David motioned for silence and switched off the flashlight. The sound of footsteps echoed above them, and he knew they weren't alone. The masked figure from the cemetery descended the ladder, stopping in the middle of the room. Carolina held her breath, and Tom gripped her arm, trying to keep her calm. The figure moved closer, scanning the room. David knew if they were discovered, a confrontation would be inevitable. Suddenly, David's flashlight slipped from his hand, hitting the floor with a loud clatter. The masked figure turned instantly, and David knew there was no more hiding. He stood up, facing the stranger, with Tom and Carolina following his lead. The four of them stared each other down for what felt like an eternity until the masked figure lunged forward. David dodged and tried to disarm the intruder, but he was quick, wielding a long, sharp knife. The fight was intense, and David found himself using every reflex he had to stay on his feet. Carolina and Tom tried to help, but the stranger was skilled and seemed to be a step ahead. Finally, in a swift move, David managed to knock the intruder down and pull off the mask. The face underneath was familiar. It was Jack, John Vasquez's former partner, who had been missing for years. Jack laughed, as if he knew something they didn't. "You think you can end this?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "There are more secrets in this town than you can imagine. It's not just about the Vasquez and the Montgomerys. It's about all of us. We're all damned." David and Tom restrained him, but Jack seemed unfazed, as if he knew he held all the cards. Before they could ask anything, he let out one final, chilling laugh and murmured, "Blood will always have its price." Then, as quickly as he had arrived, Jack fell unconscious, leaving them alone with the riddle. Carolina approached David, her eyes full of questions, but he just shook his head. He knew the answers were still far from complete. As they climbed out of the basement, David looked up at the sky. The sun was higher, but the weight of what they had uncovered seemed to keep the darkness around them. Tom was deep in thought, while Carolina still held the document, as if it was the key to everything. David knew they needed to decode the pact's meaning before they went any further. If there was truly a curse, they would need to find a way to break the cycle that their families had created. But Jack had made it clear that wouldn't be easy. The three of them knew they needed to act fast because the danger was getting closer. On the way back, David stopped the car by an old bridge, looking down at the river flowing below. He knew he was at a crossroads, a point of no return. There was something darker and hidden within the pact, and he needed to find out what it was before it was too late. Carolina and Tom walked over, and the three shared a look of solidarity. They were united by the truth but also by the risk they would face together. David held the document and looked at them. It was time to take the next step. David, Carolina, and Tom returned to the warehouse, spreading out the documents they'd found. The yellowed pages held stories of greed, betrayal, and secrets that had sustained the rivalry between the two families. There was something sinister in those lines, a feeling that the hatred between the Vasquez and Montgomery families was only a piece of a larger, darker puzzle. Yet, even with everything laid out before them, there was one element that remained a mystery. Something that didn't quite fit. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the warehouse. Someone was approaching. David gestured to Carolina and Tom to stay quiet, positioning himself behind a stack of crates while keeping an eye on the door. The door swung open, and the hooded figure of Jack stepped inside, his face twisted with anger. He held a gun, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on David. Without a word, he aimed the gun and fired. David dove to the side, feeling the bullet skim past his shoulder. Tom reacted quickly, grabbing a metal bar and charging at Jack. The two of them engaged in a fierce struggle, while Carolina sought cover. David regained his balance and rushed to help Tom, knocking Jack to the ground. But Jack was strong, and even while pinned down, he fought like a cornered animal. During the scuffle, Jack let out a mocking laugh, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can stop this?" he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "There are more secrets in this town than you could ever know." This isn't just about the Vasquez and the Montgomerys. It's about all of us. We're all cursed. David tried to restrain him, but with surprising strength, Jack broke free and grabbed the gun again, this time pointing it at Carolina. She froze, but before Jack could pull the trigger, Tom tackled him again, bringing him down hard. In the chaos, another shot rang out, followed by a heavy silence. Jack collapsed, and David, still shaken, realized that the fight was over, but the mystery was not. Jack had hinted that the families weren't the only ones tangled up in this dark web. David searched Jack's body, finding a note with an address scrawled on it. He showed it to Carolina and Tom, who were still trying to process everything, and they knew they'd have to go to that address. It was the only way to uncover the full truth. They drove to the location, an abandoned house on the edge of town, surrounded by tall trees that gave it an eerie, almost funeral-like atmosphere. Inside, they found the place filled with old records, files that extended beyond the family feud. Among the papers, they discovered what appeared to be a diary, detailing the secret activities of a group that had controlled the town for decades. David read the opening lines, feeling a chill down his spine. The diary spoke of rituals, blood pacts, and promises of unbreakable loyalty. The following pages listed the names of influential people, many of whom David knew. As he continued reading, he realized that the Vasquez and Montgomery families were only one part of the story. The whole town was implicated, with each family carrying a piece of the secret. Carolina thumbed through the diary, her eyes widening as she uncovered more revelations, until she found Laura's name, David's wife. There were details about her death, revealing that she had known too much, making her a threat to those involved. David's anger flared. Laura hadn't been a random victim. She'd been silenced because she'd discovered the truth. He looked at Carolina and Tom, realizing that they, too, were now exposed. But at that moment, he also found the motivation he needed to keep fighting. Tom, having read enough, slammed the diary shut, a fierce determination shining in his eyes. He understood now that this affected not just his family, but everyone around them. There was no going back. They'd have to confront the people behind it all, starting with John Vasquez. David knew that John was in deep and that he might have answers to their lingering questions. Back at the Vasquez mansion, they found John seated in his armchair, his cold, calculating stare suggesting he already knew what was coming. David and Tom closed in on him, and Carolina, holding the diary, began questioning him. John, with a weary expression, started to talk, revealing more than they had expected. He confirmed that the town was controlled by a secret council, made up of various families who created their own rules, manipulating events to suit their interests. The Vasquez and Montgomery families had once been part of this council, but over time, hatred had driven them apart. John went on to explain that Laura had infiltrated the council to uncover the truth, but she'd been found out and paid for it with her life. David felt anger bubbling up inside him, but he kept his composure to extract as much information as possible. John admitted that the council had sworn an oath of loyalty to a pact, the very one that kept the town tangled in a web of lies. The crow symbol, which they'd seen so many times, was a reminder of the council's power, and of the vow to keep the truth buried forever. He finished by saying that the only way to break the cycle was to destroy the documents and all those who knew the secret. David, Carolina, and Tom left the mansion with the diary in hand and a plan in mind. They knew it was a dangerous move, but it was their only chance to expose the truth. As they drove away, the sky began to darken, as if even the weather could sense the storm that was coming. The town, with its pale lights, felt like a battleground about to be engulfed by a tempest. David looked at his companions, knowing that despite the risks, they were ready to fight. David, Carolina, and Tom felt the weight of the secrets they now carried. The diary, filled with dirty details and shocking truths, was a powerful weapon, but also a threat to everyone who knew its contents. They realized they couldn't trust anyone, and time was running out. However, before making any decisions, they agreed to meet where it all began, the boundary between the Vasquez and Montgomery properties, now wrapped in thick fog, as if hiding something even deeper. When they arrived, Carolina opened the diary, revealing the final page. It was a letter written by someone named Eleanor, a woman who seemed to be the matriarch of the secret council. Eleanor coldly described how the town had been shaped to serve the council's interests and how each family played a part to maintain power. Yet, she also warned of the consequences of breaking the pact, stating that any attempt to expose the truth would curse all the descendants involved. David looked at Carolina and Tom. To expose what they had uncovered, they'd have to dismantle the council from within. He suggested they go to the local newspaper and hand over the evidence, but Carolina hesitated. She remembered the threats and Jack's warning about the price of blood. David, however, had no doubts. He was willing to sacrifice everything so that Laura could finally have justice. He looked at Carolina, sensing her fear, but also the fire of determination in her eyes. Tom, on the other hand, looked torn, but he nodded in agreement with David. They decided to burn the diary right there, to erase the secret and finally break the cycle. Carolina pulled out a lighter and, with trembling hands, lit a flame that consumed the pages quickly, leaving only ashes and the faint smell of burning paper. They felt a sense of relief, but at the same time, something felt off. David watched the fog lifting, and that's when he noticed someone watching them from a distance. A hooded figure, a shadow that seemed to merge with the darkness, stared at them with cold, watchful eyes. Before they could react, the figure approached. It was an old man, emanating an aura of authority and threat. He introduced himself as a former council member, someone who knew every detail of the pact. He looked at the ashes of the diary and smirked, as if he knew that wasn't enough to erase the past. David prepared to confront him, but the man simply raised his hand, revealing a second diary, a copy of everything they had just burned. He declared that there were multiple copies and that no matter how many they destroyed, the pact would never be broken. David felt a surge of anger, but he knew he couldn't act on impulse. The man disappeared back into the fog, leaving them alone and stunned. They understood that, no matter how hard they tried, they'd never be able to fully erase the council's power over the town. Carolina, tears in her eyes, looked at David and Tom, realizing they were up against something much larger than they'd imagined. But David decided this wouldn't be the end. They might not be able to destroy the council, but they could still expose the secrets in another way. They returned to town, gathering at Carolina's house. They decided to use technology to spread the truth. They scanned the pages they had found and began sending digital copies to all their contacts, including the press. David knew that once the information was out, the council would lose control over it. He felt a sense of satisfaction as he watched the messages being sent, knowing that what they'd done would have unpredictable but necessary consequences. The next morning, the town woke up in an uproar. The secrets had spread, and the council no longer had control over the information. Although they hadn't directly dismantled the group, they had weakened its influence, and that was already a victory. David looked at Carolina and Tom, feeling that Laura could finally rest in peace. The cycle wasn't completely broken, but they had taken the first step. The town was shaken, and he knew their actions would bring not just peace, but also a fresh start. The council, now exposed, would try to resist, but the truth was in the open, and no one could contain it. David, Carolina, and Tom parted ways, knowing that their lives would never be the same. But they also knew that what they'd done had brought hope to those who had lived in the council's shadow for so long. They had faced the truth, and in doing so, they'd found something even more powerful: freedom.